So last time we have, basic two very important crucial point in terms of, implementing security for a given communication. We can have something like security for data integrity and security for the messaging protocols to be, specific security for the authentication protocols. Okay. And authentication is one of the most important part where we start the communication. So whenever we're trying to understand how can we achieve security for the communication, there are these two clear, topics, two clear heads where we have to concentrate in terms of where we need to address the security at a crucial juncture, right? So first is data integrity. Well, there's no first or second. Data integrity and authentication. So what we have understood, whenever you start communication, you implement whatever security you have and try to basically maintain it. And that's how the authentication protocol does work. The other security is the data security. So in data security, whatever we stored in terms of data, and these data can be cookies, data can be archived web pages, data can be your, even database server for that matter. So whatever data you have in terms of most probably locally. So wherever you're working on a server, desktop, laptop, palm top, smartphone, this phone, that phone, the data integrity and the authentication are the two most important points we have to consider in terms of maintaining security in terms of understanding how we can secure these devices uh, from various, intrusion, vulnerabilities, and everything, right? So let's try to understand again. It is security services that deals with the identifying any alteration to the data. So what we are trying to understand here, anything changes that data, we need to understand who is doing that. He or she does have, proper authentication with him, or he or she is basically have the credentials or have those rights to change that thing, even read for that matters. In database, we are concerned about read, write, modify, delete, and backup, retrieval, and all these kind of scenarios. So there are these six total entities we normally address in terms of data integrity, and we do give credentials, we do give rights to the person who is trying to access this database elements. Okay, the data may get modified by an unauthorized entity intentionally or accidentally. Integrity services confirms that whether data is intact or not, since it has last created, transmitted, or stored by the authorized user. Now, for these things, in late 1960s and 70s, what we did, we built a traceability in our data. So whatever database you use, they have inbuilt function called traceability. So to create a database and start using the data, traceability is one of the most crucial aspects we will consider as a point to call it a database. Now, what is the traceability? Traceability in terms of whatever data is changing, or going to change, we need to understand who is doing it, at what point, and what type of credential he or she has. So these three things, and from which entity to which entity they've changed the data. Well, you can store the older data with a timestamp whenever it changed, and you can store the new data in the database itself, right? And this is how it happens. But this cycle gets complete whenever the user, the person who is accessing those things, it can be a system or a person. In that scenario, we need to make sure we have this traceability in place, and for that, then only you can restore whatever has been changed. In case of, if we find out that there are some challenges in terms of the authentication protocols of the entity who have updated the data. So this way, what we normally do, we normally keep the traceability of a database, and there are some specific tables allocated within the database for such change. And then there are some certain additional facilities like e-change, validated. There are n number of such facilities now given in the database to make sure whatever you change has been traced back to you or the person who have requested that change, who have either done that change, and so on. So integrity services confirms that whether the data is intact or since it was last or not, since it was last created, transmitted, and stored by an authorized user. So this is what we call integrity services or traceability services for a given database. Data integrity cannot prevent the alteration of data, but provides a means for detecting whether the data has been manipulated in an authorized manner or not. So what we are trying to do within database, we have a table called user, guest, and all the other levels of credentials as we discussed about. Now, whenever you verify this user with that database user table, you'll find how much authorization, authentication that user possesses. Be it a machine, be it a female or male, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, whoever is changing the data has to be traced back, which is username, and then subsequently IP address, region and everything. And we're going to find out how we basically trigger such entities from these, traceability or just the username basis. Here, the username is not just the username. It's not like, Ravindra at his local server.com. No. The Ravindra is normally, yeah, as I told you, Ravindra at the local server.com. So whenever that user is hitting you in terms of getting access of your database, is traced back to the server, then the IP address, then the region, and so on and so forth. So this is how we trace the user, and many a times we have even the route where the packets have reached your server. There are methodologies, there are various techniques where you can basically virtually route your packet to n number of different servers just to make the process complicated. But at the end of the day, you have to have the originator in terms of where that packet have been originated, in which submask, in which region, and so on and so forth. So this way we're going to find out, we're going to learn how we can basically get the trace to work for you. Okay. So we'll learn in few slides, but let's try to understand data integrity cannot prevent the alteration. That's the inbuilt facility of the data. If you try to prevent it, then the database slows down in terms of efficiency, in terms of data throughput. So we have agreed on a global level, many of the databases, they don't prevent you from alteration of data, but it traces down to your n number of request generation and so on and so forth, but provides a means of detecting whether the data has been manipulated, updated, modified in an authorized manner or not. If it's authorized manner, well, good. Then we can have something called commit, or otherwise we do revoke. And these are the proper database commands called commit and revoke. Whenever you run database modeling language, you'll have these two commands guided to you, like what is commit and what is a commit means whatever has been changed has to be made permanent, and revoke means whatever has been changed has to be revoked, cancelled out in totality. Okay, now let's have a look at other authentication. Now we have a separate branch in cyber security for data integrity and for authentication. And then we have another branch called vulnerability testing or threat testing as well. So there are three distinct branches of cybersecurity: vulnerability or threat testing, authentication or access media or what they call IAMs, access rights, and then data integrity. Okay, so authentication provides the identification for the originator wherever that request has been generated from. Is he a certified user? Is he authenticated user? Does he or she have the respected credential to access the said services, or whatever server he or she is trying to access? The receiver that the data is received has been sent only by an identified and verified sender. Even in database integrity, we do trace the authentication in terms of where have we have got this request created from, generated from, or originated from. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, sir.
So as a cybersecurity expert, I have three main topics to be understood and three main topics to be chosen from in terms of my career. Either it can be generic vulnerability or threat assessment type of career, data integrity type of career, or authentication type of, partygram where I can make my career in. Okay. As far as overall cybersecurity goes, you can keep playing on all these three, But you need to concentrate depending upon your overall, uh, uh, experience, thought process, whatever career you choose, we need to concentrate on those tools. We will cover all these three, so don't worry on that part, and you can decide afterwards also. I'll leave it up to you. But we need to make sure, and you can concentrate on any one of these that will give you a clear idea to the interviewer or to the recruiter or to the hiring manager saying, okay, now this guy and girl have a specific choice, specific concentrated efforts on a particular topic or particular cybersecurity branch, and that's how we basically step in, in terms of cybersecurity as an expert. Okay, and yeah, it's a kind of a long path. It's not just a ribbon cutting ceremony. I told you so, and you understood. It's basically trying to understand or match your personality in this. The data integrity talks about careers like cyber forensics. It talks about career like analyzing cyber analyst in terms of for a given scenario, given the data given to you, and these career path can extend to data scientist and all those things. In authentication, you have even the career like intrusion detection or a trigger mechanism where any unauthorized access can lead up to the overall penalization or understanding how this request is generated and so on and so forth. So these distinct careers we need to understand along the way whenever we start learning about the cyber security in terms of how we're going to adopt the career to. Okay, now let's take a bit of light on authentication services. And as I told you, this is another branch of cyber security you could choose your career from. The authentication services has two variants: message authentication and entity authentication. Message authentication identifies the originator of the messages without any regard to router or system that has sent the message. Now, this is what we can call tracing the message to its origin. And then we have entity authentication. It's assurance that the data has been received from the specific entity, say a particular website. Is it complete? Is it concise in itself? Apart from the originator, the authentication may also provide assurance about the other parameters related to the data, such as date, time of creation, transmission, and every other. So there are lots of things happening in the background. The router is not just the dumb data transporter, but the router is an intelligent supercomputer, as you can say, because router has so many number of processors to code or decode or channel the whole packet routing, and it also maintains a trace for it. So for that trace is really important whenever you want to do analysis afterwards, or what you can say reactive analysis or even real-time analysis. You can understand where these the packets are coming from. Okay, and then there's something called non-repetition. Non-repetition is basically a property that is most desirable in situations where there are chances of dispute over exchange of data. And this is predominantly talk about that order type of thing. Once an order is placed electronically, the purchasers cannot deny the purchase order if a non-repetition service has been enabled in this transaction. And every e-commerce site, so whenever you have that e-commerce cart is enabled, we have this non-repetition service enabled in that transactional server. So every such transaction, be it economical, be it something called of legal commitment, be it something called of I give my word to you kind of scenario, there we normally have these non-repetition services enabled for those servers. And so whenever the server originates such services, they normally go on along and intimating the routers in its path to make sure these non-repetition services have all the data it's required to audit trail or auditory facts, so that this trace is basically audited and a report is also submitted to the receiver saying, okay, for non-repetition, you can have this trace to be presented in the court of law, so that in case any dispute happens, you might need to present this data to them. And believe me, this way, we have made sure all the digital transactions are traced back to its original. So when you talk about something like, blockchain, right? They say they have hidden this non-reputation and they've added a new, protocols. But believe me, till date, I'm really not confident if it's really working as far as blockchain goes. And that's why there are many blockchain challenges we can see throughout our, day-to-day life. So as of now, I still believe blockchain is not a stable currency or it's not a stable mechanism in terms of solving the problem of cyber security. Because when you say blockchain is successful, you're trying to go away with these non-repetition clauses. They said you have a trace embedded in the packets and not in the routing services. No, but the way we have defined these routers in non-repetitions, we have all the trace maintained by the router. So I can call to the original or I can reach to the original or reach to the originator of these services. So this way we have also, trying to learn how these, new technology or some part of a new technology can be a challenging for these setups, which we have already included or already, embedded facilities for, the certainty of transmission or certainty of the trace. Does that make sense to you? Any questions so far? Are we good?
Yes, sir.
Okay, no problem. Let me, take you further. Now let's try to understand how these cryptographic primitives work. Now these primitives are basically wherever we try to understand. It's a kind of okay. This is a kind of, I believe it's old slide, but let's revise, no problem. In cryptographic primitives are nothing but the tools and techniques of cryptography that can be selectively used to provide a set of desired security services. So how do you tackle security in terms of, the communication lines? You do encryptions, you use something called hash functions, and use something called MAC authentication codes as well. And then we have digital signature also, which are added in late 2000, year 2000 or so. So let's try to understand one by one. I believe we have understood the encryption. We will understand hash functions in couple of sessions. The MAC authentication code are basically a MAC identifier given to us, system which has a processor, RAM. RAM is a storage area. Processor is basically a processor who can work, who can clear the instructions queue, who can act on an instruction. And we normally, whenever these processor and memory initialized with something called operating system, there is a MAC generated. MAC is basically a machine authentication code or a message authentication code, which you can identify throughout the globe. So even if you're using something called Arindo, Raspberry Pi, or a smartphone, here we have, we can have octa-core smartphone or a single-core smartphone, which is kind of smallest smartphone. We'll have something called MAC code attached to it, so that whenever we try to hide our identity, still we can go to a level of MAC and try to identify where the MAC has been, located, or how this MAC have originated that message, that request, that access, request for a given server at some originated point. And then we have digital signature. Digital signature is a kind of additions which we have done in latest decades, so that we can understand, or we can basically authenticate the sender with some certificate. And well, there are some, web portal certificate as well, or there are some certificate given to a web portals of the trust and all. But other than that, digital signatures are typically for an individuals who are signing a deal in mostly those non-repetition clauses, where you can be easily traced out with your number, name, address, and all those scenarios which are embedded in the digital signature. So this way, if Ravindra Pandey is saying, okay, yes, please go ahead and put this order. So whenever Ravindra Pandey says that, it means he have digitally signed it, and there could be an entity called digital signature which get attached on by default to all such messages. Okay. I believe we had a look at symmetric and public key encryption, right? Do you want me to play that video again? I've even shared some more videos on symmetric and public key encryption as well. Please guide me. Do you want to see the video again?
I'm okay, sir.
Do you want to? Okay, I'll play.
I think Sonali ma'am was not here last time, so.
Yes, sir. Yes, thank you.
You want to see it, right? Or not? I couldn't get the answer.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
Okay, no, give me a minute. I'll start that video. Come on. Symmetric key encryption. Come on. Come on. This is challenging to see them.
Hello, welcome to the postgraduate program. Free training, I will look at the two basic types of encryption that are used in computing. I will also look at how these two types of encryption can be used together in order to improve performance and security. These fundamentals will help you deploy encryption later on and improve your understanding of how certificates work. In today's environment, encryption is an important part of computing. In order to keep your files secure and have secure communication, you need to use encryption. Encryption is the process of taking data and encoding it into a form that cannot be read by unauthorized people. There are two types of encryption schemes that are used. These are symmetric key and public key encryption. First of all, I will start with symmetric key, as this is the easiest to understand. Symmetric key encryption uses the same key to encrypt data as to decrypt data. This generally makes it faster than public key encryption. The problem with this method of encryption is in order for data to be decrypted, the key must be available. This causes two problems. The first problem is the key needs to be stored securely. If an attacker were to gain access to this key, they could decrypt any data that key was used to encrypt. It is common for symmetric keys to be stored in a safe place and only accessed when required. The next problem is if another party needs to decrypt the information. In order for this to occur, a secure channel needs to be used to transfer the key. For example, a common practice is for the key to be transferred using the telephone. Public key encryption uses two keys, a public and private key. To illustrate, imagine that two people want to communicate with each other. In between them is a third party that is trying to eavesdrop on their conversation. With traditional encryption that uses the same key, the problem is getting the key to the second party without the third party obtaining the key. With public key encryption, the public key is required to encrypt traffic, however, it does not need to be secured. If a third party were to obtain the public key, they would not be able to decrypt any data that was encrypted using it. In order to decrypt the data, you require the private key. The private key needs to be stored securely, but the advantage is the encryption can occur without the private key. This means the private key never needs to be transferred, and thus there is no chance that it can be intercepted by the third party. You may wonder exactly how a system like this can work. The mathematics behind it are complex and beyond the scope of this video, but I will give you a summary of how it works. When data is encrypted using the public key, it is done in a way where there is a large number of possible solutions available. In order to decrypt the data, you would need to test every single solution until you find the right one. Although possible, depending on how big the key is that is being used, the process could take 100 years. If you have the private key adds enough information to the puzzle so that there is only one solution. It is kind of like having a prize behind a series of numbered doors. If you know which door the prize is behind, it is easy to find the prize. Without this information, you are forced to try every door or choose one at random. Public key encryption is generally slower when compared to symmetric key encryption, and thus, even though it has advantages over symmetric key, you will find, for reasons of performance, symmetric key will be used instead of public key encryption. Like a lot of things in computing, it comes down to a trade-off between performance and security. In order to get a good mix of performance and security, it is possible to combine public key encryption with symmetric key encryption. In some cases, public key encryption is used to exchange keys and symmetric key used to encrypt the data. The principle is that a strong algorithm with a large key should be used to encrypt the key. Public key encryption is very useful to perform key exchanges securely. Once the key exchange is performed, another encryption algorithm can be used that is faster and uses a smaller key. This could be another public key encryption algorithm or a symmetric key algorithm. The next use of public key encryption with symmetric keys is to protect the symmetric key. Encryption, like Windows file encryption, uses a symmetric key that is stored in the file. To protect the symmetric key, it is encrypted using a public key. This gives you a fast algorithm for encrypting files and keeps the key safe. Encryption systems like BitLocker use similar methods. This is why when you reformat a computer or delete a user, you may lose access to encrypted files. The new OS or user does not have the private keys that were associated with the user or OS that are required to access the symmetric key. For these reasons, symmetric key encryption is often used when performance is required. Public key encryption is used when you do not want to have decryption occur without the private key. You will find that some systems combine the two to give multiple users access. For example, Windows file encryption uses a combination of both encryption types so that multiple users, including recovery users, can access the symmetric key. When multiple users require access, the symmetric key is simply encrypted multiple times with each of the public keys required. It should be pointed out that either method can meet the needs of data encryption and communication, but combining the two does give a good trade-off between performance and security. Thanks for watching this video from IT Free Training. For the latest videos, please feel free to subscribe. Thanks, and see you next time.
So here we try to understand how we can basically combine these multiple, cryptographic primitives or, a different cryptographic type to make it more secure for the users to access, these site to access these entities over the internet. And anybody have any questions as of now for me? Anything which you haven't understood or need some clarification?
Oh, sir, I'm good.
Yeah. Right. I'm going to share this link basically with you so that you can go to it, the actual YouTube page, have a look at them, have a look at different type of videos, other videos he or she have posted again. Okay, so let me take you. Let's try to understand in terms of how these primitives are what you can say available for what type of clauses or tools, right? So let's try to understand encryption. Encryption is just for the confidentiality. Encryption doesn't ensure the integrity. Then we have hash functions where we normally try to just maintain the integrity. Hash functions talks about those parity checks, those volume checks, those timestamp checks, and all those things. Then we have MAC addresses where we typically use MAC for authentication as well as integrity, and it's also included sometimes for the non-repetition. For the digital signature goes, it's mostly used for the non-repetition, but you can, make sure the integrity as well as authentications with the digital signature as well. But digital signature is a certificate, which is a kind of heaviest of all these things. Encryption is basically an inline replacement of the bytes or the transfer packets, right? Hash functions are normally an additional checks, and MAC addresses are also kind of additional check, which are normally initiated at an authentication time. So we need to understand these four different scenarios if you want to make a career in the access right or the authentication type of cybersecurity analysis, track. Okay, so I'll give these hints along the way. So try to understand how it fits. And I might be wrong in certain scenario because there's a mix and match of these routes. So there not you can say a clear demarcation between these careers. But overall, this gives you a good headway or good approach to the problem. So a cyber forensics can look at the crime scene from one angle other than the authentication cyber analyst type of scenario. So where he will mostly check out who's have initiated this, who have started this, and how we can trace back to it. But cyber forensics normally goes on a level where he or she can understand who triggered this in terms of events, in terms of the after effects, and how the progressions of these events have actually occurred. Like a typical, forensic analysis, which does in terms of normal crime scenario where you check out the fingerprint, you dust out the fingerprints, you dust out or try to, get the time of death in case of any fatality and all those things. So there are, different approaches throughout this cybersecurity track, and we'll learn them one by one. Okay. We have understood, symmetric cryptography and asymmetric cryptography. Let's try to understand or revise our symmetric cryptography, and we'll understand how we implement these things in a real life scenario. So in symmetric cryptography, an encryption process where same keys are used for encrypting and decrypting. We have seen this in our last session where the key is shared with the other party, with the receiver via some other channel. It can be smartphone. If you are talking digitally, if you're talking on a smartphone, you might use the SMS type of protocol or WhatsApp mechanism to share the message, or email to share the message, and so on and so forth. So normally the key is shared with a different medium. Even if you look at the credit card you get the keys separately. You get those PIN number. PIN number is a key basically, which is a kind of symmetric key. You get it separately with the separate email, separate letter, and so on. So here, symmetric key encryption works like the encryption process where same keys are used for encrypting and decrypting. The information is known as symmetric key encryption. The study of symmetric key crypto system is referred as symmetric cryptography. Simple enough, right? And symmetric means same on the both sides, or it's balanced. Symmetric crypto systems are also sometimes referred as a secret key crypto system because only one key is used from both the sides. A well-known examples of these type of encryptions are digital encryption standard, or what you can BES, or triple disk, what we've seen, IDEA and Blowfish. Triple disk is mostly used in credit card industries where you encrypt the key on the thrice or three levels, and then you can have another levels also if you felt a need for it, and that also can be done. But triple disk is a standard name of cryptography or symmetric cryptography we use for credit card communications or financial transactional communication. Okay, so if you want to have a good look, you can just search triple disk to YouTube, and you'll get all about the details of how this encryption is achieved for a given banking transactions or economical transactions, even forex transactions and everything. Just trying to share the knowledge in terms of a conceptual diagram of how symmetric key works. So it's a shared key which is securely distributed by another channel. and the actual plain text is actually whatever we are sharing with our client, which get encrypted, and then we normally call it ciphered text, which is decrypted at the receiver end. And the insecure communication channel is basically where we are not what you can say, eating away the efficiencies of your networks in this symmetric cryptography. That's why it's really famous. If you look at the other encryption channels, we tend to eat up the data bandwidth. We tend to eat up more of data to be transferred whenever the things are encrypted. But in symmetric cryptography, we are talking about just kind of sharing this thing across with the same number of packets and making it a bit of insecure channel. I'll not say it's completely open communication channels, because we still have the modulations, we'll still have the overall, archived type of text transfer. Also archived in the sense we normally compress the text before transmission, so that all these text file which are got compressed at around 90 to 99% of the compressions. Compressions like, anybody don't know compressions or compressed message transfer?
Is it kind of like a zip file?
Yes, very rightly said. I was going to say that. So zip file is basically what you compress. See, whenever you send even your email message, if it's longer than 3 lines, and I think that's a standard for Google, every mail service have their own standard. If it's longer than 3 lines or 24 words, the message is normally get compressed and then sent. Okay, why I'm saying this, 24 words or 3 lines or so many letters, this is a standard thing which is used by Google, because compressing just hi doesn't make any sense. Actually, WhatsApp does that, but it doesn't make any sense. If that hi is tagged by any other person, well, let it, tag those scenario, right? But still, when you talk about email services, email have been originated for something called Pine services, which were developed in late 1960s on a Unix server. And this Pine is basically a C structure which has an entity called receiver ID, sender ID, subject, message, or message body. And these C structure with a definite limit to its character length, which is a kind of text transfer when it actually programmed, and we still use Pine structure within our email with the addition to the attachment. That's the binary form of the overall attached mail message, and it goes separately than the mail, and we'll see how that thing works as well. But overall, when you look at the cryptographic transfer of email address, we have decided, or Google have decided intelligently, that compressions services on their server or even at the receiver's end doesn't make sense if the message is too short. And what is too short? Lesser than 24 words, lesser than 3 lines. So when you say, dear Ravindra, I want to talk with you, could you please give me a call whenever possible, and regards. Well, these are like 4 lines, right? Sorry. So 24 words or 3 lines. And if your message is lesser than that, it gets transferred as a plain text. Just try to understand as a thumb rule. With the Microsoft Hotmail, it might be different. With Yahoo Mail, it might be different, and so on and so forth. With whatever email services you are using, depending upon their setting, you have to, they'll do these things. So this is basically configuring the mail effectively. That's what I'm talking about. Or configuring the send and receive message mechanism effectively or intelligently. Okay. Does that make sense to you? Why we do that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this was the questions asked in, I think, there was a research fellow recruitment for a cyber security analysis at MIT. And that, the request have came through, I think, DICE to GuruSchool, and I was supporting the interviewee, and that's how I got to know this, thing. So that interviewer have clearly asked a question. So what do you think, which is the median for plain text transfer via email in terms of symmetric cryptography? That's kind of really, odd question to ask. I was keep thinking like how and why he asked. And when I did a research, on my 3rd day, I found out he was looking for an answer, of basically how that median have been achieved in terms of this cryptographic transfer for an email. And that's how this thing have been, the answer have been revised. And even later, I have, got his contact from the LinkedIn. I'm connected to him. He's a double doctorate in mathematics as well as physics, and he's really leading a department at MIT, Massachusetts, Boston. And that's how these guys, keep creating these intelligent questions. And that's how we need to understand what he or she is asking in a good amount of time so that we could answer the correct, we could answer it correctly. Okay, so let me move on to the next slide where we'll just understand how the overall efficiency proficiency works. Person using symmetric key information must share a common key prior to the exchange of information. Well, not prior, you can do it after also, depending upon the decryption request or the efficiency required at the other end. If you have any question, please do ask. I can stop and answer that question and then we can move on. These are the thought process which we need to understand. And I'll share the PPT also today, pardon me. I have not shared it yet. So that you can go through these presentations and try to start creating your thought process in terms of which channel suits best to you, or you can just keep thinking and we can decide later on. So no worry. Okay, so symmetric cryptography keys are recommended to be changed regularly to prevent any attack on the system. So if the key has been shared, like we do it in a, let's say, credit card. Credit card is not a digital communication mechanism, but just to understand the example, you get the PIN only at the start. Well, then you can change it. And many credit card organizations force you to change the PIN code after your before your first use as well. Or many card company for that matter. Forget about credit card or debit card, right? So this way, we keep changing this symmetric key. Why I have given you credit card example? Because credit card example means we use credit card, debit card, credit card anyway. So it's more near to our life. If I told you about the email services, well, Google have lifted the restrictions on how many, I think 91 days length to the email password. And email password was a symmetric key for Google. And these are all things given if you research for Google email communication, Google encrypted email communication, or Google secure email communication, and you'll get all these details. Try to do that, okay? And you get to understand how this communication works. So they had a limitation of you can keep your Google password maximum for 91 days. But then they've gone away with that because quite a good amount of users from North American regions have said or have requested, I don't want to. And believe me, these requests came to Google from around 60% plus users. So Google have been almost forced to, of implementation of such decision in this scenario. So they've gone away with this 91 expirations, 91 days expiration for your password scenarios. Now we have unlimited expiration. So the password doesn't get expired. So this way, these symmetric cryptographic keys are shared across, which does mean that in Google scenario, we are more vulnerable as far as the symmetric keys goes. The password and your username is basically a composite symmetric key they've used from one end to another. A robust mechanism need to exist to exchange the key between the communication parties. But keys are required to change regularly. This mechanism becomes expensive and cumbersome. Expensive in the sense, well, you need to spend some efforts on the server as well as client end, right? If you look at the sheer number of the Google users and everything, you could understand how many processor cycles are required at a server end. Well, the client end can, do it on their own sweet time, on their own, single user or multi-processor user system. But at a Google end, even if 10% of their, users try to change the password, there are many chances of service not available kind of challenges received by other users. And this has happened. There was a news in CNN as well as, other news top media in North America in late 2019, where they've seen that Google user database have been hacked. Please change your password immediately. And in those good old Tuesday evening hour, where these information have been leaked around 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. in the evening, the Google services all over the globe have experienced a DOS attack. Do not accept any new user, or the server is available for new users acceptance, and something like that sort. It's a kind of cyber attack. But here, that attack have been triggered by a news given by a news major, and Google have sued them as well, because this was a fake news which got in and which where CNN said we got that news from a trusted source, and legally due to federal rules they have not at a liberty to disclose that disclose that trusted user. And that's why there was a big legal battle gone between Google and CNN and some other news like Fox and all those things, to basically check before the organizations whenever you're trying to damage any reputation. And it was a suit of reputation damage from Google on CNN and other news media. So try to understand how critical a single password change can be for a business. And this is what we find in those good days. So these type of case laws, these type of cases which have gone in the history do support us how secure, or how important is to find the median between security and between actual efficiency. And that's how we have to basically decide. And it's for everybody, everybody's own business, rather than implementing a thumb rule. Like we told about 91 days password change policy, right? Similarly, for every service provider, they have their own way of addressing security, be it Microsoft, be it Google, be it NASA, North American military, and so on and so forth. A group of n people to enable two-party communication between any two persons, the number of key required for the group is n into 2, n into n minus 1 divided by 2. And this is a standard thumb rule which we have devised from a statistical formula, and which is normally followed. But again, when you talk about Google, we are talking about n into n minus 1 into 2. So if you have 2 billion users, we are talking about 2 billion into 2 billion minus 1 by 2. It's like 4 billion, how much then? It's like I come to 3 billion, right? No, it's 2 billion only, right? So 2 into 2 minus 1 is 1, 1 by 2 is half. So 2 into half is 1 billion. So you have to have 1 billion key. Does it possible? Or even if you count in millions, does it possible to have 1 million, the number of keys to be distributed? No. So what we do, you normally go with user ID and password, combination of a symmetric key. And it's not as straightforward as you think, like my first name's, this character and that character. No, it's a basically selected pattern depending on the timestamp we have encountered with. And it's not a, what you can say, we will discuss about it whenever, we go to the hacking things, and we'll try to understand how these keys are formed, and we'll try to understand how hackers think in terms of decrypting this key or trying to get a symmetric key for two communications. The length of key or number of bits in this encryption is smaller, and hence the process of encryption or decryption is faster than symmetric key encryption. Processing power of a computer system is required to run symmetric algorithm is lesser than the asymmetric, because asymmetrics are more or like additional calculation on top of whatever calculations you are doing. Here, the symmetric cryptography puzzle is solved at the session start and closed at a session end. And it's simply one or two measures, cycles more than whatever you're doing for communication. So it's not an overhead as such. It's a less of a, inline communication than it's overhead like in a asymmetric key. Does that make sense to you, or am I confusing you more? Again, this is the way I'm sharing this thought process from my experience. So the sequence of my explanation can be a bit disturbing, but if you try to understand, you'll understand at the end of the day why this is, why such precautions have been implemented, and what is the median every organization expresses um, itself for solving their security challenges. Okay, please do ask me if I'm confused you, or if if I'm going into too technicality. That can be a problem, because I have started my career as an assembly programmer. So I tend to go to that level, like bit transfer and all those things. I'm trying to prevent myself to go there. And from there, you can clearly understand how these cycle calculations are done in terms of extra work given on the both end. On the client end, client like us, we can spend a couple of cycle and it's hardly matter to us, or we hardly got to know such scenario. But at server end, if you multiply by the users in typical something like a Google email scenario, or if you even go to the Yahoo email scenario, where there are hardly 100% of users actually using the Yahoo mail. But still, when I'm trying about the current scenario, don't quote the history here, please. If Google has, let's say, 2 billion users, Yahoo hardly has, I think, 1 million or 1.8 million or something like that. So around about 100 of the Google users, still it will be a challenge, because even 10% of those users, like I'm talking about 100K user, is trying to change password at a given system. The Yahoo server will not collapse, but will go into the high processor degree, high processor usage, scenario where it can stop processing the web request, and that's how the DOS act actually happens. We're going to learn these attacks in really detail whenever we learn those terminologies of these attacks. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on symmetric communication, symmetric cryptographic implementation?
No, sir.
They are good, right? Okay, sure. And asymmetric. Now let's try to understand where these asymmetric key are important and where do we basically work on this scenario. Okay. Now, asymmetric key encryption, as we see, these are the different keys. So we are talking about one key at another key at another end. The encryption process where different keys are used for encrypting and decrypting the information. It is also known as asymmetric key encryption. Though the keys are different, they are mathematically related. So it's not like that, I'm using username as a key and you're using password as a key. No, there are some related models, related mathematical models, like cipher text we have understood. We need to use the similar mathematical model to decrypt also. Retrieving the plain text by decrypting ciphertext is feasible. Ciphertext is what we call encrypted text. Asymmetric key encryption was invented in 20th century to come over the necessity of a pre-shared secret key between communication persons. The silent feature of the encryption schemes are every user in this system needs to have a pair of dissimilar key, a private and a public key. If you look at the same example of a username and password, my public key is my username and password is my private key. Okay, but still, we'll see in the example. So every user in the system needs to have a pair of dissimilar keys, private key and a public key. These keys are mathematically related. When one key is used for encryption, the other key can decrypt, and that's a name. Other key can decrypt the ciphertext or encrypted text back to its original plain text. And we'll see how basically, don't worry. It requires to put the public key in a public repository and a private key as well as a guarded secret. Hence, the scheme of encryption is called public key encryption. Public key is public, private key is stored somewhere where you keep changing the place, you keep changing the key, which is mathematically related to the public key. Through public key and private key, the users are related. It is computationally not feasible to find one from another. So if you know the place of a public key, you couldn't able to make a head or tail out of where the private key has been stored. So this strengthens this scheme, and normally it was assumed to be hacker proof whenever we started with asymmetric key encryption. But yes, there are some loopholes how the hackers have used to even decrypt the communication used with the asymmetric key as well. Okay, let's try to understand logically how this is achieved. So host sends a private key and a public key. Public key is released on a repository. You can understand in the simplest possible way as a username password kind of scenario. Username is basically public. So my username ravindrapande@gmail.com or Ravindra Pandey is a standard you can say public key, and my password is my private key. Now this repository is Google repository, right? So in Google, he has the Google database has stored a public key, username Ravindra Pandey, normally accessed from these IP address or these subnet mask. Subnet mask, we're going to learn what is subnet mask. Is a group of IP address where the user is normally uses this email ID. So when I go to from India to, let's say, if I visited Cambodia and I start using Gmail, they'll trigger an alternative verification or validation mechanism to make sure, hey, Ravindra Pandey, your subnet have been changed. So you're moved from one region to another. So could you please supply me your mother's maiden name or your birth date or your zip code of your last residing address and so on and so forth. And that way, Google do verifies the private key again. And there can be a repository of public key 1, public key 2, and so on and so forth. The plain text get encrypted with public key as well as private key. And then this private key, which is downloaded from the same repository by the host 2, can decrypt the cipher text to a plain text. Is it could you understand what I'm trying to say here? Any questions on asymmetry? We are good, right?
So, sir, host 2, have they received like a public key from the host 1? Diagram for me is kind of it's flowing, and I got lost from repository to the host 1.
Sure. No problem. Repository, let's try to understand. Let's go back to the example of a Google email server. Google email server use a symmetric key, but still let's understand from a username and password. These are the two keys. Username public key because it's available publicly, right? And your password is your private key, which is known to you and the Google server only, as you believe, and let's believe that also. So whenever you sign in on Google from your normal location, let's say you are in St. Louis, Missouri, and you sign in on almost daily basis, or you're continuously sign on. And one day your organization says, hey, Pratik, could you please work from a European office, or could you please visit our European office and do these 3-4 things? So you've gone to Europe and you've signed into the Google. So Google say, hey, Pratik, you are from Pratik, St. Louis, Missouri, but now you're accessing from London or Heathrow or wherever you landed, right? So what Google does, Google has an intelligent mechanism where it understands, okay, you have the public key, you also have a private key, but let me put an additional checks and balances in case, if somebody else is trying to access your account. Now here, forget about the intelligent mechanism. Let's try to solve the public key and private key type of issues here. All my public key and private key are there on the Google email server. Public key is visible to all, private key is not visible to all. They are related. So if you really go to the Google database server and try to find out users from St. Louis, Missouri, you might find Pratik and you might find your email, your password as well. But could you do that? No, those database servers are very secure. Even if you try to access, you'll get caught. But in a real scenario, if you look at the host is moved from St. Louis to, let's say, London. So whenever host try to access the public key, it's available. Public key, no problem. Whenever he tries to access the private key, so whenever you key in your password, which was a kind of private key, Google server remembers some additional attributes from the receiver, and it tries to enable extra checks and balances. But in actual real scenario, The public key, well, it's not transferred at all. It is referred. Private key is also not transferred at all. It is referred from another place. So you might have an IP address for a public key at one place, another IP address for a public key at a different end, but where you normally send public key as well as private key. Sorry, another location for your private key. But whenever a host 2 sends the public key, you have to also send the private key with some additional information to decrypt those private key if you want to receive it again. Normally, private key is received at the start of a session and it keep validating till your end of the session, because you don't want to load the network just to retrieve and decrypt, added those decryption cycle again and again. So whenever you do such scenario, these extra precautions get triggered to make sure whoever is using those services are already authenticated, or he or she can revalidate himself for using those services. Does that answer your question, or am I confused you more? I couldn't understand. Pardon me for that.
No, the thing is, you are trying to make me clear, but for me, I feel it like I'm sitting in a tennis court and watching a match.
Sorry.
No. I'm just trying. I will do some.
Could you please put in your own words whatever you understand, and then I can take you to the end.
Okay.
Please.
So technically, host 1 is a sender and host 2 is a receiver. Now, host 1 has two keys: a private key and public key. Public key is the username, and the private key is the password. Now, host 1 would like to send a message to host 2, and this send it to the encrypted level to the host 2, where the host 2 need to be decrypt that message, but host 2 required a key. Now that key for host 2 is a private key.
Yeah,
but
host required 2 keys, not 1 key.
The private key for the host 2 and the private key from the host 1 as well.
As well as public keys, sir.
Or public, as well as public keys.
That's right. So host required 2 keys. My public key is available.
Public key is available, yes, because the sender has the username over there.
That's
so the
right.
public key is available, but host 2 required a private key for himself to decrypt that message.
Perfect.
Now repositories has 2 keys. Host 1 public key and host 2 public key. Technically, those are the media, right? Like example, Google is a repository where it receive the message from host 1 and send it to host 2.
Right. The username can be easily transferred, right? Now, when host 2 requires that private key, he have to refer to some different location than the public key, and that location is normally given in a communication, and then with some mathematical additional details like how to basically supply to the location to retrieve private key, or what information you need to supply to the repository to retrieve the private key. So private key has to be retrieved by the host 2 from same repository or mostly different repository, and that different repository name or different repository IP address or a server name is normally supplied with the first handshake within the session. Okay, yeah, I forgot this. Okay, so whenever the first handshake happens, you normally get a location or a kind of repository address and how to retrieve the private key, which is also a kind of a partially related mathematical model which the host 2 normally has within themselves. Okay,
so let me make it clear in that point. So example, when host 2 use the public, there is a username and password, like
Right.
public key and the private key. So once they enter the correct password, technically for host 2, it's a handshake with the repositories that, okay, one level is clear that host 2 is a genuine guy who support.
Right.
Now, once the host 2 receive that email from the host 1, now host 2 is asking repositories to, send them, send host 2 a decryption key.
That's right.
Then repository might verify another level, or they just send it to host 2 and then they can decrypt the message.
Right. And these mathematical models are normally decided by the service provider, the repository like Google, or like, any service provider for that matter.
Understand?
Okay. Sure.
Yep.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, sir.
Most welcome. No problem. Now, okay, we have seen these building SOC. Yes. So building SOC, we have okay. I think jumping the whole sequence of it. Pardon me for that. Here, what we are trying to do, we are trying to present the overall how SOC can be built effectively with logical as well as physical challenge, physical security challenges. Here, we have seen all those logical challenges which use. I normally use this slide at the start of my okay. So now we are at a logical juncture where we have completed the overall encryption type of communication handshakes. Now we are venturing into different section of our cyber security sessions where we will understand different technologies, different terminologies which is normally used throughout our cyber security communication, cyber security interviewing process specifically. Now you can see all those acronyms here. I believe we know internet. We need to understand the router in depth. We need to understand firewall in depth. We need to understand the web content filterization also. Then IPS, bridge detections. Well, router will definitely understand how router is different from switch. That we'll understand. And then we'll understand how these users are, categorized based on laptop, desktop, tablets, phone, this phone, that phone, and all. And then what do you mean by quarantine network? What do you mean by employee network? How it different from the quarantine network? What do you mean by trust network, and so on and so forth? And how does this switch perform? That's also we will understand. And then there are some tools like NetFlow, NAC, which are set on a switch or a what you can say gateway, and then filter this traffic or monitor this traffic in depth. Then we have something called data center and SOC tools, where we try to secure any infrastructure logical, boundaries with tools like PCI, payment card interface, non-PCI, where we normally keep checking vulnerabilities, keep checking any request from a known, not known challenging source or known disturbing source. Then we'll try to understand what type of security tools we are going to use, what type of data collections or data archival mechanism we use to tackle cybersecurity leakages, and how we can protect server from all the requests. So nowadays, all the requests going to any servers are normally monitored, are normally filtered, and then only these servers go, these servers get a request. Try to understand from this diagram, like if a guest user sitting, let's say on the internet, he, requests something like, give me your directory of such and such folder. The request come to the user's border router. Then we go to the firewall. Then we go to the actual router within that infrastructure. Then we go to the switch in terms of to which IP address the request is targeted to. Then we'll move to the actual internal firewall of those departments or those server, and then it'll go to the server, where the firewall will actually make sure if the server have been configured not to receive any such request, they'll get refused at this firewall or at the switch only, so that the network traffic won't get disturbed further, and the user will get a response saying, well, this is not allowed on this server, so you can't have this request processed, and so on and so forth. So we're going to understand all these things And on top of that, we're going to use what is malicious user, what is a white hat, hacker, gray hat hacker, and all those things. Then we'll also understand what is a rogue device, what is a non-compliant device, and so on. So, okay. So this is just an overview of what we're going to start learning. Okay. Let me take you to the next sphere. Let's try to understand what is an IP address. Can anybody tell me what is an IP address?
IP address, it's just the address like your home address is in words, but IP address is in number.
Great analogy. Thanks for that. An IP address is normally in a format of x.x.x.x. So there are 4 different entities, and it's a basically 32-bit address. So 8-bit, 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 8-bit. So there are 4-digit numbers, 4-digit numbers, 4-digit numbers in a pair of 4. Internet protocol address or is a numerical address which is assigned to each computer on a network. So whenever you go on a network, when you connect to the internet, specifically network means internet now for a generic assumptions. So whenever you go on the internet, you get an internet protocol address which is normally referred as IP address. Be it a small phone, Raspberry Pi, Arindo, any machine. Now machine or a system means processor, RAM, processing power, and a storage. And that will get an IP address. So even if your smartwatch will get an IP address. And this IP address belong to a region, belong to a what you can say subnet mask, and we'll understand that as well in a few slides. So I believe we are clear in terms of IP address. Let me play a small video for you on network basics, which will make us understand how this network basics helps us to understand the further difficult terminologies as far as cybersecurity goes. Now, these basics are really important in terms of interview clearance. So if you know, please don't stop. Please revise this scenario so that we are gearing up for the interviews. And that's why I normally request everybody to even replenish their thought process. Okay, and if I'm sharing any thought process which is not in line with whatever you experience, please be vocal about it. Okay, because here we need to understand there are different regions, there are different nomenclatures used by these regions, and as an interviewee, I need to make sure I'll not step on anybody's shoes while giving interviews. And let's keep our ego aside. Many interviewer or interviewee in specifically, they kept thinking they are right in all scenarios. You might, but actually wherever you're giving interview, there are some thought process which we need to use. And please keep in mind, these sessions are made in line of those, because we go through quite a lot of interviews for these cybersecurity enthusiasts, right? So I have updated these cybersecurity presentation from that angle as well. Okay, so please let me play that video for you, and then we'll take the questions.